You ever have one of those moments where someone tells you no so confidently, so smugly, like they're doing you a favor, and you feel something inside you click? Not anger exactly, more like clarity. Like you realize, oh, you don't think I'm capable of pushing back. You think I'm the kind of person who folds. That was me, standing in my driveway with a letter in my hand, staring at my yard like it had suddenly become a courtroom, and the judge had already decided I didn't matter. The letter was from my HOA, and the message was simple: fence request denied. Reason: incompatible with the heritage vision of Maple Crossing. Maple Crossing. That's what they named our neighborhood, like we're a quaint little town in a snow globe. In reality, it's a regular suburban development outside Raleigh, North Carolina, full of the same beige houses, the same builder-grade shutters, the same Amazon packages getting dropped off like it's a daily ritual. But the HOA here acted like we were preserving some sacred historic district, like we were one bad decision away from becoming Times Square. Here's the thing. I didn't want a castle, I didn't want a statement, I didn't want to go viral. I wanted a fence because I have a dog. A rescue mutt named Biscuit, small body, big opinions, and a deep spiritual commitment to sprinting into the street anytime a squirrel looked at him funny. I also have a 6-year-old who thinks it's hilarious to accidentally leave the back gate open, and a neighbor who grows these fancy hydrangeas and treats them like her children. So yeah, I wanted a simple fence. Not tall, not ugly, not electric, not anything dramatic. Just a plain, tasteful, white fence, the kind of thing you see in literally every family movie when they're trying to show you these people are normal. I did what you're supposed to do. I filled out the form, attached the drawings, paid the little processing fee they call administrative, which is HOA language for "we like taking your money," and I waited. 2 weeks later, denial. That's when I learned something about Maple Crossing. It wasn't run by rules, it was run by one person. Her name wasn't on the letter, but I knew who it was immediately. Celeste Hawthorne, the HOA president. Celeste had the kind of presence that made you feel like you were being graded. Always perfectly put together, pearl earrings, pressed blouse, sunglasses even when it was cloudy. She smiled like customer service, but her eyes did not smile. Her eyes were a locked door. I'd had run-ins with Celeste before. Nothing huge, just little things. A warning email because my trash can was visible from the street for more than 2 hours after pickup. A notice about my porch light being too bright. Another one because my kid drew chalk hearts on the driveway, and it created visual clutter. Visual clutter. Imagine being so bored you're threatened by sidewalk chalk. And I'll be honest, I used to just take it. Because I'm that guy. I grew up being the kid teachers called quiet, which is another way of saying easy to ignore. I did my job, paid my bills, tried to keep my head down, and for most of my life, that worked. Until it didn't. Because some people mistake quiet for weak. And the HOA? It's basically a machine designed to reward that mistake. So I showed up to the monthly HOA meeting. It was in the clubhouse, which is hilarious because the clubhouse looks like it was designed by someone who typed generic community center into Google Images. But they decorated it like a museum exhibit. Framed sepia photos of old barns, a little display shelf with antique-looking lanterns that were definitely from HomeGoods, and this giant banner that said, "Preserving our past, protecting our future." I sat in the folding chair, holding my folder like I was about to defend my dissertation, and Celeste looked at me from behind her little table with the HOA logo on it, like she was the mayor of a small country. She tapped her pen against the paper, sighed dramatically, and said, "Mr. Nolan, your fence design is not consistent with Maple Crossing's character." I blinked. "It's a fence." She smiled politely. "A modern fence." I said, "Celeste, half the neighborhood has fences." She tilted her head. "Those were installed before the current standards. That's HOA talk for, we changed the rules after the fact, and now you're stuck." I tried again. "It's for my dog. He runs." Celeste leaned forward slightly, voice soft like she was talking to a child. "Then perhaps you should supervise your pet more responsibly." Something about that did it. Not the words, exactly. The tone. The assumption. Like I was irresponsible, like I was asking permission to be a normal person. Like my problem was an inconvenience to her personal aesthetic fantasy. I looked around the room and saw a couple board members avoiding eye contact, one guy nodding like a bobblehead, and this older woman in the back clutching a binder like it was scripture. It hit me then. This wasn't about fences. It was about control, and I was tired of being controlled. I stood up, smiled, and said, "Okay, no fence." Celeste looked satisfied. "Wonderful. Next item." She thought it was over. It wasn't even starting. That night I went home, put Biscuit on a leash, walked the yard, and I just stared at the property line like it was a chessboard. Then I opened the HOA bylaws. I read them like my life depended on it. Not skimming. Reading. Highlighter. Sticky notes. The kind of focus I usually reserve for assembling furniture when the pieces don't make sense. And halfway through, buried under landscaping and exterior harmony, I found it. A clause that said any perimeter structure had to reflect the neighborhood's heritage character through appropriate materials and design. It went on to ban prefabricated fencing of contemporary style. Prefabricated. Contemporary. That's where Celeste was living. But the clause never said the word wall. It never said stone. It never said masonry. It never said historic. Just heritage character, appropriate materials, and design. You know what material screams heritage? Stone. You know what isn't prefabricated? A wall built one rock at a time. And right then, I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt calm. I felt creative. Because if Celeste wanted heritage, I was going to give her heritage. Not her little Pinterest board version of heritage. I mean real, heavy, inconvenient heritage. The kind that makes people stop and stare. I called a local mason the next day. His name was Hank. Thick forearms, sunburned neck, the kind of guy who says buddy and means it. I told him, "I want a stone boundary." He said, "Like a garden wall?" I said, "Not exactly." I sent him pictures. Old coastal forts, Scottish ruins, colonial stone fences that look like they've been there since the earth cooled. I told him I wanted it to look like it belonged to a different century. Uneven stones, rough edges, not too perfect. Hank was quiet for a second. Then he laughed and said, "Who are you mad at?" I said, "An HOA." He laughed harder. "Say less. We did it right. Permits, property lines, survey, everything legal. I'm not stupid. I wasn't building a crime scene. I was building a loophole." The first delivery showed up on a Tuesday morning. A flatbed truck carrying huge slabs of stone, the kind of stones you don't associate with suburban life unless you're building a fountain at a shopping mall. Biscuit lost his mind. Barking, circling, acting like the rocks were invading. My kid ran out with a juice box and said, "Are we building a castle?" I said, "Something like that." Hank's crew started laying foundation. Neighbors came outside with coffee mugs like it was free entertainment. At first it was curiosity. Then the wall started rising and curiosity turned into confusion, then concern, then that special suburban emotion where people feel entitled to an explanation. "Is that allowed?" someone asked. I smiled and said, "It's compliant. It's heritage." And that's the part that made it delicious. I wasn't hiding it. I wasn't sneaking. I was doing it with a straight face. A week in, Celeste finally showed up. Not in person at first. She sent an email. Subject line, "Unapproved construction notice." All caps, of course. I replied with one sentence. "All permits are filed, and the structure is consistent with Section 8.4 regarding heritage materials." 10 minutes later, her car was in front of my house. She stepped out like she was walking onto a stage, heels clicking, jaw tight, sunglasses on even though it was 5 p.m. She stared at the half-built wall, her mouth opening slightly like she couldn't decide whether to speak or faint. I walked over, hands in my pockets, casual. "Evening, Celeste." She pulled her sunglasses down just enough to glare. "What is this?" I said, "A boundary wall." She said, "This is not approved." I said, "It doesn't require the fence approval process. It's not a fence." She snapped, "It's acting like a fence." I smiled. "It's acting like a wall." Celeste took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You're doing this to embarrass the board." I leaned in slightly and said, "No. I'm doing this because my dog needs to stay safe, and because you told me my fence wasn't good enough for your vision." Her face tightened. "Maple Crossing has standards." I said, "So do I." She looked at the stones again, then back at me, and you could see the calculation happening. If she screamed, she looked irrational. If she backed down, she lost control. She chose a third option, the HOA Classic. "We will be discussing this," I said, looking forward to it. She turned and walked back to her car like her spine was made of steel. The wall kept going up. We added little details that weren't necessary but were deeply satisfying, thicker corner posts, a slightly arched entry gap with a wooden gate, and along the top, not spikes, nothing unsafe, but a subtle uneven stone cap that made it look old. Not aggressive, just permanent, like it had always been there. Then came the escalation. Because once Celeste realized she couldn't stop it easily, she started trying everything else. The safety concern complaint. City inspector came, checked the permits, checked setbacks, shrugged, left. The drainage issue. Another inspector, same result. The property value panic. She rallied a few loyalists to stand at the corner with printed signs that looked like they were made in Microsoft Word. One said, "Keep Maple Crossing open." Another said, "Stop the fortress." Fortress. That's when I realized the wall had already won, because now it had a nickname. My favorite moment was when my next-door neighbor, a retired Navy guy who never speaks above a mumble, walked over, stared at the wall, and said, "This is the funniest thing I've seen in 10 years. Hank's crew finished the final section on a Friday. The last stone slid into place like a punctuation mark. I stood there in my yard, looking at it, and for the first time in a long time I felt something I didn't even know I'd been missing. I felt respected, not by the HOA, by myself. The emergency HOA meeting happened the next week. Full room. People packed in like it was a town trial. Celeste opened with a speech about community unity and shared values, but her voice had that tremble you get when you're trying not to scream. She pointed at me like I was contagious. This structure is hostile. It is disruptive. It is not in the spirit of Maple Crossing. I stood up slowly, held up the bylaw printout, and said, "I agree it's disruptive. That's kind of the point of safety barriers. But it is absolutely within the written rules." A man on the board tried to argue intent. I said, "Rules aren't vibes. They're words." Celeste's cheeks turned red. "You are weaponizing the bylaws." I said, "No, Celeste. I'm using them. The way you use them." The room got quiet. And in that quiet, you could feel something shift. Because everyone there had their own story, their own warning letter, their own little humiliation. The time their trash can was wrong. Their holiday lights were too long. Their porch decor was not harmonious. My wall wasn't just about me anymore. It was a symbol, and that made Celeste furious. She tried one last shot. "We can vote to demand removal." I said, "You can vote all night. But you'll also be voting to start a legal fight you will lose, and you'll be using everyone's dues to do it." That's when the treasurer, a tired-looking woman who'd clearly had enough of HOA drama, quietly said, "He's right." Celeste snapped her head around. "Excuse me." The treasurer didn't flinch. "He has permits. The language doesn't cover walls. If we pursue this, it's a liability." Celeste looked like she'd been slapped. The vote happened. The board tabled further action, which is their fancy way of saying, "We can't do anything, and we hate it." People filed out whispering. Some looked at me like I was reckless. Others looked at me like I'd done something they wished they could do. Celeste walked past me without speaking, but her face said everything. It said, "You didn't follow the script I wrote for you." And I went home, closed my gate, and watched Biscuit sprint across the yard safely, free and happy, without a leash for the first time since we moved in. Weeks turned into months. The wall became normal. Kids rode bikes past it, people took pictures, delivery drivers joked about it, and slowly, Celeste stopped sending emails. Then one day, a moving truck showed up at her house. No announcement, no goodbye, just gone. Rumor was she'd moved into a new build community with no HOA. The irony of that tastes like candy. But here's where it gets complicated, because after she left, the HOA didn't disappear. It just got quieter, less theatrical. The rules were still there. The power was still there. And sometimes I'd catch myself staring at my wall thinking, did I make things better? Or did I just win my personal war and leave everyone else to deal with the same system? Because it's easy to cheer when the bad guy loses, but what if the real villain isn't Celeste? What if it's the entire idea that a group of strangers gets to decide what acceptable looks like? And that's the part that still messes with me. My wall stands there, heavy and solid, a reminder that quiet people have limits, and that if you push them long enough, they don't always explode. Sometimes they build something legal, something undeniable, something that forces everyone to look at the rules and ask, who are they really for? So now I've got a question for you, and I genuinely want to see people argue about it in the comments. Was I wrong? Was I petty? Was I a hero? Or was I just another guy adding chaos to a neighborhood that wanted peace? And if you've ever lived under an HOA, or worked under a boss, or dealt with a teacher, a parent, a coworker, anyone who used standards as a weapon, tell me what you did or what you wish you'd done. Because I promise you, there are a lot of quiet people watching this, thinking about the day they finally stop apologizing for taking up space. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, subscribe, and drop your take below. Should HOAs have this much power, or are they just legalized bullying with better stationery? I'll be reading the comments, and I want to know where you stand.